Hello, I'm Chuck Martin, and welcome to the Voices of the Internet of Things podcast. With me today is Mo Morales, Associate Director of Innovation and Snap Program Principal at SapientRazorfish, the agency that services almost half of the Fortune 100 companies from more than 70 global offices. Mo has been involved in design and innovation for many years as an experienced design manager at Sapient Nitro, a designer and creative director at VirtualMo Transmedia in Oregon, and as an interactive prototype developer. His current work involves leading the global expansion of the Snap Innovation Program, mentoring creative and tactical teams, and leading creation and ideation workshop. Mo joins me here at the annual FutureM conference in Boston. Welcome, Mo.
Thanks very much, Chuck. I'm really glad you're interested enough about what's going on in the world of Mo and SapientRazorfish to spend a moment with it.
Yeah, so tell me what you've been up to these days, and the audience doesn't know about the Snap program, I'm guessing.
Okay, well, let's start a little bit with the creation story of Snap. So originally, I was hired to create a physical digital prototyping capability in the Boston office of Sapient Nitro.
Which is a big office.
Which is a fairly big office and a small drop in the pond of a much, much bigger organization. So just the quick backstory is that the person who hired me to create this new capability after 2 months left the organization and pretty much left me without a job. So I figured, well, we didn't really necessarily need to look for another job. What I decided to do was just take the torch and run with it. So what I created was the SNAP, which was an acronym for the Sapient Nitro Accelerated Prototyping Program. And so what we did is actually randomly intersect an audience, which could be, as an example, new home buyers, or could be adventure travelers, and then we randomly connect that with a technology, and those technologies may be drones or biometrics or beacons, as an example. So through that program, what we do is we call it a 2-2-2 process. We have a 2-hour multidisciplinary ideation, which then pushes into a 2-day concepting phase. And from those concepts, 3 concepts are pitched to what we call a green light committee.
Can you talk about those 3 steps?
Absolutely. So our 2-hour multidisciplinary ideation phase is where we get about 12 to 15 people in a room, and I run them through an ideation around this intersection of a random audience and technology. From that point, we then explore what are some of the needs of this audience. And once we determine some of their needs, then we take the technology that had been randomly assigned and we say, so how can that technology serve that particular audience? From that 2-hour guerrilla research, I think is a really good way of terming it, we then push into 2 days of concepting. And concepts are are differentiated from ideas in that they've been vetted against a number of specific criteria. Those criteria include, do we have the resources to create the concept that we're proposing? The resources in this case are 2 weeks of hands-on making and $500 budget. So
that's a low budget.
It's a very low budget. And the program is designed specifically to create these very tight constraints because, as Noam Chomsky says, without a system of formal constraints, there are no creative acts. And I believe very strongly in that. I feel like what it boils down to is the tighter you squeeze someone, the more creative they have to be to pop out from getting crushed in whatever it is they're trying to endeavor.
So these people are all Sapient employees?
This is an internal program.
Okay.
And it's also not connected to any of our delivery capabilities. It's actually connected to our learning and development operations. So the idea of the program is to take 2 makers, one taken from our creative teams and one taken from our technology teams. And we put them through the 2-2-2 process as a way of forcing these 2 makers into an unknown situation for them, both creatively and technologically, coupled with the constraints I just mentioned, as a way of expanding the creative problem solving. And it's a way of also developing our people to think differently. And I know that's kind of maybe a dated term, but it really applies here because the program is based around physical prototyping, which is making with the hands. And the reason why we focus on that is because working with your hands uses different channels of your brain. When you're using different channels of your brain applied to a creative or technological problem, you're approaching it from a very different tool set. So that's the intended outcome of this program, is to force our people to think differently. Once the two makers have spent 2 full days concepting, they come up with a number of concepts which are then pitched to a leadership committee. We pitch them to the leadership committee in order to get buy-in at a higher level, so that at some point when someone says, "Why in the world did you make that thing?" I can go back and say, "Well, because you said it was a good idea." So that's just a little job security for me.
And the budget stays at 500 still?
Budget stays at 500. Once one of those concepts has been green-lighted, the makers then have 2 weeks to realize that as a fully functional prototype. Now, if your audience is interested in seeing some of the prototypes we're talking about, I would direct them to srsnap.com, where we have a repository of our video case studies. Where I've been at recently is, as I mentioned, this program started in Boston, but the program has grown regionally and now globally. So the reception internally to this program has been very enthusiastic. And once we stood up a SNAP program in our New York office, I've now just returned from Sydney in Australia, where we've set up our first global office, global program, and I'm headed next month to our Singapore office to set up a program there. So as I mentioned, the reception has been very positive. And
so when you set up a program in an office, say Sydney or New York, do they then have a team leader like you who runs the process?
Absolutely. So I work with local representatives of the company there, find someone who has the sort of alchemy of skills and experiences just to make the outcome something somewhat tangible and connected to what the intent is. What do I mean by that? Well, it's a very unusual cocktail of skills and experience which are required in order to navigate this serpentine process from nothing into something. And as I tend to get a little philosophical sometimes, and I talk about the Platonic ideal, which Plato said, our world is only a shadow of the real world, which is in the ether. So what I do is I basically reach into the ether, grab nothing, and drop it on the ground and create something. And so
sounds like IoT.
That's exactly what it is. But as some of your audience may know, and I know that you know, Chuck, Sapient Nitro is no longer. So when we merged with one of our former competitors under our parent company, Publicis, we are now SapientRazorfish. So a lot of people were asking, well, what's going to happen with this SNAP program, since SNAP was Sapient Nitro Accelerated Prototyping? We thought about rebranding it, but SRAP was not an option. Dropping any sort of secondary words, SAP was not an option. So I turned to my executive sponsor and I said, listen, we enjoy a lot of brand recognition with the SNAP name. Why don't we just keep it SNAP and just drop the acronym? So Sapient Nitro Accelerated Prototyping has now become SNAP. So we are now SNAP Accelerated Prototyping. All that is a very long-winded way of saying that the momentum is with us internally, and SNAP continues to be SNAP.
So can you give me any examples of programs that you've done, whether here or New York or anywhere else?
Absolutely. So, what I like saying is that I don't create machines, I created the machine that makes machines. And I like to look at it from that perspective, because the SNAP program is really nothing more than a methodology. And by employing this methodology, the results can be owned by whatever the needs are of a local office. As an example, when I'm just returning from Sydney, the Sydney office doesn't necessarily do this, service the same types of clients that some of our other offices, such as Boston, service. There's different markets, different verticals. So when we set up an ideation session, which has the 10 random audiences, those will change from the audiences that we typically work with for our Boston clients. Our Sydney clients have different market share or different market interests. So we adjust the audiences for relevance to a local office. As an example, here in Boston, we do quite a bit of work with insurance and banking, et cetera. So our audiences will be drawn from those verticals. But in Sydney, their verticals are different. Their verticals may include adventure travelers or university instructors, which we could be doing that also, but we in Boston don't really work with universities in their marketing interests, but they do in our Sydney office. So when we endeavor to create a prototype, we will make the relevant we will make the relevant audience fold that into the process. So then, when we come out of the final process, we have some sort of functional IoT device that is relevant to their particular markets.
So what would then happen with that device?
So, well, that's a difficult question, Chuck. What I'd like for that to happen with that device is that someone find interest in it and then it move on to maybe a higher level prototype or maybe even put into a pilot program or some beta testing. But that's not the intended outcome of the program. As I mentioned, it's really about creating an opportunity for our people to think differently. However, there have been a number of IoT prototypes that have enjoyed a little bit of extra attention and have been employed into beta programs. As an example, we have a prototype called Blink, a language of love through light. Blink is a gesture-based interactive IoT device that connects two people through gesture specifically as a way to keep people connected through distance. The intended audience for the Blink system is people who, unfortunately, families who may be dealing with a medical issue, particularly for a child. So imagine a child is in a hospital for an extended period undergoing some long-term treatments. The parents can't be there 24/7. So we've partnered with one of our clients, Ronald McDonald House, to set up a program wherein a child can be in that room, can have one half of the Blink system, which is a small glowing sphere, and the parents would have the other side of that paired device system, which is another glowing sphere. And when the child interacts with that device with specific gestural interactions, a number of taps, a number of shakes, that sends specific messages to the receiving sphere, in which the parent can then respond and send messages back. So the reason why we're exploring this is SapientRazorfish acknowledges that the future of connected commerce as well as interactivity and connectivity will really reemerge into the physical. And through a prototype such as the Blink spheres, we're able to explore not just explore, but also research firsthand, how do some of these interactions, how are they bettered, how are they made more seamless, how do they interact with other technologies, including web-enabled technologies, how can we connect web and screen-based experiences to the physical world. So
in the case of Blink, which I've obviously seen, there's the issue of the child interacts with the sphere, and the parent may not necessarily be looking at the sphere at the moment. That issue of basically of fine-tuning and developing, does that then leave your group and go into a marketing group of Sapient so that they then look at, okay, what are the details, essentially?
Absolutely. So in the case of Blink, typically our prototypes that come out of Snap are kind of put on a shelf for ripe for the plucking for whatever other opportunities may be at hand. But in the case of Blink, we already had a built-in avenue to explore this further. So when the original team who came up with the Blink device created a fairly rich and well thought through user experience, when we put it into pilot, we realized that there were some issues such as what you're talking about. As an example, Timmy in the hospital sends a message to mommy and daddy, but mommy and daddy aren't looking at the Blink sphere at that moment. And so does Timmy feel like, oh my God, what's happening? My parents don't love me. They don't even want to talk to me anymore. So we've learned through the action. Let me take a step back. the beauty of actually making something and putting it into a process of real testing is that you get real results back to make that process or that device or that interaction take it to a much higher level of fidelity. So in the case of the blink spheres, yes, we have been able to identify certain limitations or what seemed right on paper did not pan out properly in the real world. In the case that you mentioned where the ball doesn't actually respond, so we've built, through that learning, we realized, actually, one of our research families actually identified this as a problem for us that, unfortunately, and I'm not going to use their name, the child became highly distressed that there was no response, which is not really good for healing.
Right.
So, since the blink language of love through light is about helping accelerate the healing process, we figured, well, we better build in some fail-safes, in which case we reprogrammed it so that if after a certain amount of time there's no response, the ball actually responds with a smart response. So we've been able to incorporate machine learning into the process.
So you've tapped AI, basically.
Exactly.
So where does that start and leave your group and then go to another part of the organization?
So those are some of the mechanics of where, those are some of the mechanics that haven't been formalized yet. At the moment, I think what's exciting is that through the SNAP program and creating an inventory of 30 functional IoT prototypes, we've been able to then start to look at what are the opportunities for some of these devices, how can they be folded in some of our client work. And now we're beginning to formalize a process of, say, a second-level prototyping program. So that's another exciting part of SNAP, and the work that I've been doing over this past year, besides the global expansion of the program, is also not just expanding it horizontally through the different offices, but also expanding it vertically. A formalized program of taking specific prototypes that show some particular potential value for our clients, and pushing them up into a higher level of process. So I don't have a specific answer for you at the moment, but it's something that we're working on very aggressively.
But it's an awareness, so you're aware of it as an organization.
We're absolutely aware of it. We see a lot of potential and a lot of opportunity.
So you said there are 30 IoT things?
There are 30 SNAP prototypes.
So what are some examples?
Well, we have, as I think I mentioned earlier, the srsnap.com has, we're a little bit behind in our video case studies. So I believe there are 18 video case studies from our 30 prototypes. But some of the other examples are junkyard drones, as an example. The audience that we were investigating were motorheads or car builders. And the reason why we have an audience of car builders, even though we're like a digital marketing agency, what do we have to do with car builders? Well, a lot of our clients are car manufacturers. So we're tapping into a subset of their client base. So by looking granularly at a narrow slice of a particular user group, we then randomly was selected the technology of drones. So how can drones...
This is how your system works.
This is how my system works, yes. And the randomness is actually a part of a process that comes out of what's called the Ideator 9000, which is a very fun part of our process. It's an artifact of ritual when we go through the process, and where we actually have a machine and we push a button.
That's that little thing with the red lights?
That's correct. It's blue lights now because now we rebranded. So drones and motorheads. In this particular prototype, this functional prototype, enables someone who's looking for a particular car part at a junkyard is now able to not only have access to the junkyards around their immediate region, but now they can search junkyards beyond what they would normally have access to due to distance. So the program allows the drone to create an inventory of available car bodies and car parts that would be in another junkyard. Say, if I'm in Boston and I need a hood from a '57 Chevy, then I can actually search the inventory of car shells that might be in a junkyard in Phoenix, Arizona, and
so
do it in real time.
Is that by image recognition or by photos?
It's doing it through video. So what happens in this particular case is that every morning a drone is sent out, and it does a video. It captures the current inventory, and then the user can go back and look at the inventory based on specific criteria. And I think that where your question is leading is how do I find a '57 Chevy car hood? So we crowdsource that information. Because the experience is so exciting and actually enjoyable, people actually enjoy just watching the drone fly over the junkyards. We then ask the users to tag specific car shells, so it builds up the inventory. So that as if I'm using it, I'm looking at this thing fly over and I say, oh, hey, there's a 72 Chevelle, and oh, hey, that's a 63 Impala, then that inventory is built up. Now, if the inventory ends up being a little bit dated, what we can do is initiate what's called a live flyby, in which case the drone can then go out to a specific vehicle and do a 360 live on video, and so that the person on the other end of the computer can see, hey, is that the car that I think it is, and also is it in the condition I need it to be? Does it have the right rear fender, which is what I'm looking for? That's one example.
So this actually works?
This is a working prototype. Now, there is one, and it works. When we developed the prototype, we used a junkyard here in Boston. But to get back to one of your earlier questions, we don't have a mechanism yet to be able to say, okay, well, let's put this in 2 or 3, and let's build the system out to see how does it scale.
But the idea is that here's a actually working prototype. Here's a concept that does work. We've tested it in a place here. So if you, Chevrolet or GM or Ford or someone want to basically own this, they could roll it out nationwide or even worldwide for that matter.
Absolutely, that's exactly it. So we position it so that our internal business consultants and some of our client services and account executives who have much closer ties to our client interests, then they can say, hey, you know what, GM, we have an interesting technology because you've been working on this particular program X, Y, and Z. We've got something that you may be interested in, and then we can further our conversation and hopefully drive a little bit of business.
So for process, how does it typically work? Does someone in the agency somewhere come to you and say, I've got a client who has this need? Or do they look at the shelf of 30 and say, okay, I've got to stay up to date on the inventory so I can pick and say, I know that I can use that for this client?
So I'll answer that question in reverse. We do have this inventory of interesting prototypes which are readily accessible to our people who can then say, hey, you know what, I was just talking to Panera, and Panera is interested in blah, blah, blah. Hey, don't you have a prototype that does something like that? I thought I saw you on one of your emails. And yes, so we can further a conversation that way, and I can step into the conversation with the client and then talk about how, as an example, Panera's particular needs might play out as how the needs of Panera may actually be serviced by not the direct prototype that we came up with, but something similar, how it sparks solutioning of particular problems that we're not thinking through ourselves because we don't have those particular needs. But however, what was the first part of your question?
The issue is how does it connect with the agency, because you're a global agency, so how does someone in some other country say, do we have this solution?
Right, so yes, that happens just because we continue to maintain this database of the prototypes that we've already developed. But what's really beautiful about the SNAP program is that it's decoupled from client needs and client interests.
Right.
This is really an internal program for us. It happens to have the collateral benefit of being able to be plugged into specific lines of business. But what we're doing is we're creating basically an inventory of interesting applications of emerging technologies from which to spark other ideas.
And at a low resource.
Exactly.
Or low cost.
At low cost. Exactly, because aside from my salary, really all we're doing is we're spending $6,000 a year building up this catalog of really interesting stuff.
So is that where some of the Sapient innovation comes from? Because I know SapientRazorfish has been doing things that it's basically technology. It's not advertising. It's really technological solutions.
Well, what your audience may or may not know is that Sapient started as a technology-first company, and only the marketing and creative capabilities came much later in the history of the organization. So, absolutely.
So where does IoT fit in all of this?
Well, IoT's everywhere, right? As we all know. Where it fits into all this is that by being able to explore and do research and development in the IoT space, we're able to with more vigor, really understand how connected commerce is evolving with respect to the way we as human beings are physically interacting with our environment, and how those things tie into broader business interests. So
everything is AI, IoT, kind of underneath.
Devil's work, Chuck.
Any final thoughts?
It's fascinating to see the development not only of how things are talking to each other, but how we as in our governance of our legislations, of our laws, of our ways of doing business, how those are being impacted by little innocuous machines having little innocuous conversations.
Mo Morales, thank you very much, and thank you all for listening to the Voices of the Internet of Things podcast.